right, I'd like to talk today about chapter 18, which is about gender, which is, I'd like to sort of bring this into our broader discussion of identity in general. We all have identities of different kinds. I've described these in terms of overlapping, maybe nested is a good word for them, like some identities are contained within other identities. Some of them are larger than the community you live in and are international identities. And something that everyone has is some kind of a gender identity. But we need to be very careful about the terminology that we use when we're talking about this, because there is a difference between sex and gender. And this is where one of the largest misconceptions about what gender is comes. Now, for an anthropologist, we need to be very precise about the terminology that we use. We want to be in agreement about the use of particular words to mean particular things. So we make a distinction between what we call sex and gender. Now, sex refers to specifically the biological differences people have, but as we'll see, even this is a non-binary. So even when we're talking about biology, there are conditions, intersex conditions, which make the question of whether someone is male or female on a biological sense complicated. There are conditions, triple X syndrome, Turner's syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, that all are biological intersex conditions where the difference between being a male and a female is actually very complicated. And it's a non-0% of the population. It's maybe about up to 1% of the human population has an intersex condition. So this is something where they are neither male nor female, but something else. A third sex, or maybe even not third, maybe multiple sexes. But that's not what we mean in the term gender. Gender is a cultural construction, whether someone is male, female, or something else. So even on a simple biological basis, it's not clearly, straightforwardly black and white. But certainly when we come to culture, the construction of someone's identity as being a gender is even more complicated and more variable depending on the culture that you're talking about. So once again, we're brought around to cultural relativism, where we have to take the concept of gender not as a fixed, unchangeable thing, but something that has a specific connotation within a cultural structure. There are some differences between males and females in humans. We've seen this in terms of, simply there are, in order to reproduce, we reproduce sexually, so there is a male and a female, and there are the sex cells that are required to reproduce are different, and the physiology is different, but that also includes things like sexual dimorphism that we saw not just in humans but other primates, where males tend to be somewhat larger than females and have some different physical characteristics. Now this means that there are certain activities that men are going to be more capable at, and some that females are going to be more capable at. But it's a continuum. It's not necessarily something that in every single case a male will be better at a particular task than a female, or in this other task every female will be better at it than every other male. I certainly know that there are females out there that are stronger than me. And I know that I'm also stronger than some females as well. So we're all on a continuum. We all have our own individual abilities, but we are trying to find general patterns. We're trying to find, and not just in terms of generalizations physiologically, but about the cultural use of these general patterns. So, for instance, the your book starts talking about Margaret Mead, who we saw in chapter 13. She was a very famous anthropologist, and she was very interested in writing ethnographies that studied particular gender roles. And she noticed that that the characterizations of different gender roles varied from culture to culture. And so amongst Arapesh women, for instance, women were considered mild, parental, and responsive, whereas the men and women in another culture, the Mundugmor, both men and women were considered fierce and aggressive. And in the Chambuli culture, she noticed that the characterization of men was catty, and women were considered managerial. So this is where some characteristics that we might consider particularly male or female behaviors or characterizations are not universal. They are specific to our own point of view, and so we need to practice our ethic. We have to be viewing things with our ethic lens. We need to think of this as anthropologists and apply cultural relativism to see how individual cultures treat particular gender roles. And can we come up with some sort of patterns and some basic terminology that describes groups of gender characterizations. So some definitions that we need to, I've even already used these words already. When we're talking about gender, it helps to use some terms that we describe gender with. And I'm not talking about sex here, I'm talking about gender. So a culture's view of what constitutes a male or a female or something else. And that is, a gender role is the tasks and activities that a culture assigns to a particular sex or gender. And a stereotype is often an oversimplified, strongly held view about males and females. I described some of those in terms of what Margaret Mead was talking about, that our stereotypes of what a gender attribute is may not be the same stereotype that another culture applies to those genders. Now, those characterizations are just something that occurs, but you also have what's called gender stratification, and that is an unequal distribution of rewards between men and women that reflect different positions in social hierarchy. And so things like resources, power, prestige, personal freedom can vary according to what society places the value upon gender differentiations. So there are physical differences between men and women and other sexes, other sexual characterizations. Genders are culture's views of how those fit into an identity, and then cultures also place values on those particular roles and stereotypes. So in your book, there's a summary of a big, broad study that was done across the world involving many different cultures that compared certain tasks that were done. And cross-culturally, this study shows that the contributions to subsistence, to survival, between men and women are roughly equal. So when you talk about a hunting and gathering society, hunted resources are going to be fewer but very high quality resources. Things like meat, you don't get often, but it's really valuable when you get it. So the hunter brings in something that's not as plentiful, but is high quality, whereas a gatherer is bringing in much more things, but is not as nutritious as someone else. So we're just talking about food resources. But in general, the things that need to be done to survive, men and women do equal parts, roughly speaking. But there are some patterns that we can see, and your book has a chart that sort of lists mainly male-dominated activities, mainly female-dominated activities, and then activities that are sort of shared cross-culturally amongst males and females in broadly speaking. This is a really good guide for us to see how some of the universal characteristics between males and females, things like sexual dimorphism, affect activities. So, for instance, certain activities are like planting and harvesting are done by both men and women. Some are almost always assigned to men, things like hunting and woodworking. Also, reproductive strategies are different between males and females simply because of their physiology. So women tend to bond with their babies in order to ensure their survival, whereas men can actually give birth or can have children with multiple partners, and so there is a tendency amongst males to have multiple partners. So there is a draw in that direction. So because males and females, men and women, contribute equally to subsistence, you would think that this would be equal value placed among them. But that varies from culture to culture based on some other elements of social structure. And we'll come to this when we start looking at kinship and the way you calculate your relationships to others. And so my last name is McCarthy. Where does that come from? You can probably predict that it comes from my father. My mother's name was not McCarthy. She took that when she married my father, and then I got that name. So that is prioritizing the male line, and that is pretty typical in our country. Is that the only way that we organize our relationships? No. And we're going to look at another chapter about kinship and lineages and that sort of thing. But as you can imagine, the value that you place on genders is going to be affected by the way that you organize your social structure, your power, who inherits property. I get, as a male in my line, I may have greater priority over females in at least traditional structure. So although contributions between males and females are equal, there is stratification, social stratification of gender roles, and this can be differentially very high difference or very low difference. So the strong differentiation between male and female roles tends to prioritize things that are done in the public sphere. So public activities rather than domestic or private activities have differential values placed upon them. And so because females give birth and have to raise children, often that means that they are tied to domestic activities, whereas males can act outside of the home, and there is a prioritization of public over private activities. And so that's where some of the value comes in, at least culturally specific valuation of gender roles. This is diminished. This differentiation can be diminished depending on, or enhanced depending on the type of social organization that takes place. So, for instance, reduced gender stratification can be seen in things like matrilineal societies. As I just described, we live in a patrilineal society. So I get my name from my father's side of the family, and if I ever had children, they would get my name, and so on and so forth. So you trace your identity through the father's side. When a woman marries into a particular family, they are joining that patrilineal side. Is that the only way that humans organize their societies? No. There are matrilineal descents as well, where you get your name and your identity from the mother's side of the family. And matrilocality means that if a male wants to marry a female, he has to join that matrilineal group. And this is what we call matrilinear-matrilocal societies. So in these situations, you have reduced gender stratification. Does that mean that there is no gender stratification, that there isn't value placed upon male or female roles? No, but you have a reduction in the differentiation between them. You might hear the word patriarchy or matriarchy. Patriarchy we'll talk a little bit about in a second here, but matriarchy doesn't really tend to be the exact mirror image of a patriarchy. Matriarchy, if a patriarchy is a political system ruled by men, that's what that means, a matriarchy isn't exactly a political system ruled by women. It's a political system where women play a more prominent role than men do in that political organization. So it's not exactly a mirror image, it's just that the differentiation and the valuation between male and female roles is reduced and there is more equality. It's not that women, at least any observed societies that we've ever seen, it's not as though the myth of the Amazon community from Greek mythology has never really existed. We've never seen anything that has existed quite like that. So in matriarchal societies, if we want to use that term, it's just a reduction in gender stratification, whereas the opposite term, patriarchy, is something different. So this is where you find increased gender stratification in patriarchal societies or patrilineal societies, which is actually what you would typically describe something like America. America is a place where, as I just described, patrilinearity is where you find your identity through the male inheritance, and you move into the male's household as a female if you enter into a marriage. So this is by far the more common. Patrilineal and patrilocal societies are far more common. Matriarchal or matrilinear-matrilocal societies tend to be most commonly found in horticultural societies, either bands or tribes. And most other communities are patrilineal-patrilocal. It's far more common. And this is where women do a lot of the subsistence cultivation, cooking, raising and tending animals, but they tend to largely be excluded from more prestigious roles in the public domain, whereas men dominate that public domain and they participate in prestige activities, prestige crops or prestige animals, preparing food for larger feasts. They arrange marriages, they do trading, and they oversee in things like rituals. But you also have the extremes of this as well. So in patriarchal societies, women have inferior social and political status, including sometimes basic human rights, that women are treated like property. You can get violence against women in patriarchal societies, in cases things like dowry murders, female infanticide, clitoridectomy, and domestic violence can be the result of extreme patriarchal societies. And abuse of women is more common in societies that have where women are separated from supportive kin networks. And so this is where patrilocality comes in as well, is that if you're entering into an unfamiliar system as a marriage partner, you're isolated from your support network, your family that you grew up in. So I'm going to move on a little bit. There's some more interesting information about women in industrial societies, but I'll let you read about that. I'd like to move next into not beyond just looking at males and females and look at gender in a broader sense. That many societies around the world and throughout history have recognized more than two genders. For instance, sometimes this is tied to age. So the German word Mädchen, which means little girl, is actually all German words have an article in front of them. All German nouns have an article in front of them, der, die, or das, which is masculine, feminine, or neuter. And the word for Mädchen, for little girl, is das Mädchen, which is neutral. It's neuter. So it's a little girl doesn't have a gender in the language even. It's not until you become die Frau that and you are an adult that you actually attain that feminine quality in the language itself. You have also certain types of jobs, like in ancient Greek, e poetas is the word for a poet. And poets were not like we think of poets today exactly. They were the singers, they were the rock stars, but they also accompanied people into battle. They stood there and they gave inspiration to the warriors that were going out to fight. And so this was a very masculine pursuit to be a poet. But in the language, it was a feminine ending, but took masculine. It looked like a masculine and behaved like a masculine word in their sentence structure. And so embedded in the language of the ancient Greeks was this sort of juxtaposition of a feminine role, but in a masculine world. And so, and it was usually men who were poets anyway. So if you were a poet, when people described you, the word they used for you looked like a feminine word. So that's historically and cross-culturally, but even in the U.S. ourselves, we include things like transgender, intersex, third genders, and transsexual individuals. And these contradict the basic binary male-female gender distinctions that by being either in part male and part female, or neither, or both. Transgendered individuals